CS2 is out, so let's get to Windows 10 LU. So starting on the main menu, we'll head across to Settings, followed by Video. Here we'll want the display mode to be set to full screen and nothing else. This will give you the best possible performance. Refresh rate should match your monitor, or at least be the highest number you have here. In my case, 165. Your resolution should be your monitor's actual resolution. Otherwise, if you're playing 4:3 stretched, the best possible 4:3 resolution, etc. You probably know what's going on here though. That's really it for this page. If you're on a laptop, you may see laptop power savings. You can enable or disable it here. Obviously, disabling this will use much more power, but you'll get much better performance in-game. As for color mode, you can choose between computer monitor and television. You should get much better color reproduction and accuracy on computer monitor. Now we'll head across to the advanced video tab. Now this I think is absolutely wonderful. You can move around this crosshair here and you can look at different parts of the image, zooming in to see the better quality by scrolling up and down, etc. This is an incredible feature and I wish more games had it. Anyways, let's start with the options here. First of all, boost player contrast. This should absolutely always be set to enabled. Even if you don't think it does anything, it should make it easier to see players and enemies while you're playing the game. Wait for vertical sync should be disabled unless you're on a weird refresh rate screen that's especially on the lower end. If you find that you're getting screen tearing, this is something you may need to enable, but for most people, leave this disabled and it should give you much improved input latency. Then, as for preset, we'll start at high and work our way down. It doesn't really matter. Multi-sampling anti-aliasing aliasing, you should set this to 2x MSAA, and that's pretty much it. You can disable it entirely, but this does result in some jagged edges, which don't show in the bottom, but they do show in the top, especially on lines, etc. If you set this to 2x MSAA, you should see most of those disappear with very little performance impact. Then, global shadow quality. Now this is a weird one for CS2. Previously it didn't matter in CSGO, but for now, players actually cast shadows in real time. So this is something you absolutely need to have enabled and turned to high for the best gameplay experience, even if it costs you FPS. This should be the absolute last setting you'd lower if you're really clawing for FPS. It is a competitive advantage. Model texture, this really doesn't matter. You can set this on low for the best performance. Shader detail, the same goes for this here. Set this to low. And particle detail, you can comfortably lower this as well. You can see the smoke in the background here is a little bit easier to see through on low versus high, for example. This isn't just a placebo, it is easier to see through smoke and things like that. And leave this, you should set this to 2x MSAA, and that's pretty much it. You can, but they do show in the top, especially on lines, etc. If you set this to then global CSGO, but for now, players actually cast shadows in real time. So this is something you absolutely need to have enabled and turned to high for the best gameplay experience, even if it costs you FPS. This should be the absolute last setting you'd lower if you're really clawing for FPS. It is a competitive advantage. Model texture, this really doesn't matter. You can set this on low for the best performance. Shader detail, the same goes for this here. Set this to low, and particle detail, you can comfortably lower this as well. You can see the smoke in the background here is a little bit easier to see through on low versus high, for example. This isn't just a placebo, it is easier to see through smoke and things like that in certain situations with particle detail set to low. So it's a competitive advantage, not just that it boosts your FPS as well. Then ambient occlusion has to do with shadows cast by objects. For example, this person and this car here. If I turn it from medium to disabled, you'll notice that quite a few of the shadows disappear and there's not so much shadow on the wall. This could be somewhat considered a competitive advantage, but it's nowhere near as obvious as hard shadows cast by players on floors and walls from the global shadow quality here. You can leave this on medium or disable it. High dynamic range, if you have this option, you should set it to performance. Then finally, Fidelity FX Super Resolution. You can enable this for much better performance, but for example, if you push this to performance, it's going to really lower the quality of your game and make things very weird. It is going to give you a huge boost in FPS, however. If you need this on, have it set to the options closer to ultra quality and quality. Having it on disabled is the absolute best for visibility, but of course it is going to use the most processing power technically. If you need it enabled, leave it on ultra quality or quality. Finally, NVIDIA Reflex low latency. If you're GPU bound in your system, make sure that this is enabled. If you are CPU bound, as in you have a much slower CPU than GPU, set this to enabled plus boost. This should give you much better improved input latency for your game, assuming you're using NVIDIA hardware. If you don't have this option, don't worry. The only thing you may want to change here is high dynamic range. If you have this enabled, on performance, you may notice flickering, especially around moving objects. If you set this to quality, that flickering is likely going to vanish. It's your preference, and it has very little FPS impact. Now that we're done with the in-game options, there's nothing else we need to do but close the game here and head across to our NVIDIA control panel. So we'll right right-click our desktop and choose NVIDIA Control Panel. Obviously, this will be different for AMD and Intel users, but if you're on NVIDIA, keep with me. On the Adjust Image Settings with Preview tab, set this to Use the Advanced 3D Settings and click Apply. From the here, which should be frame rate, for example, your browsers and things like that, you can cap the FPS while you're in games here, should affect or even Ultra, so I'll set it to Ultra. Then max refresh rate, you can cap it here, but leaving it uncapped is good enough. Scrolling down further, shader cache size, anisotropic high performance, texture filtering, leave this on, threaded optimization, auto, triple buffering off, VSync. Changes this from use the application here. I'm recording at 2K, so that's my settings. Change the output dynamic range to full from limited here and click apply. Then head across to adjust desktop color settings, and here you can select the monitor once more, scroll down, and now you can adjust your digital vibrance to give your monitor much more color. Set this to just screen or filtering, deeping that while you're out. So we'll right-click our desktop and choose NVIDIA Control Panel. Obviously, this will be different for AMD and Intel users, but if you're on NVIDIA, keep with me. On the Adjust Image Settings with Preview tab, set this to Use the Advanced 3D Settings and click